That moment changed everything. How does a man trained to fight wars respond when the battle moves into his own home? What happens when betrayal meets strategy? Stick around to uncover the shocking aftermath of this tangled web. The door slammed louder than thunder, jolting me from the haze of forbidden passion. My husband, Daniel, stood in the doorway of our bedroom, his uniform still pristine from his return. His eyes, usually calm and unreadable, burned with a fire I'd never seen before. That moment, him catching me in bed with his younger brother, Jason, was the kind of nightmare I never imagined could happen in real life. But it wasn't a nightmare, it was my reality. Daniel, I stammered, clutching the bedsheet around me as if it could shield me from the storm I had created. Jason, wide-eyed and panicked, scrambled to grab his clothes, his movements clumsy and desperate. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Jason's belt clanging as he hurried to dress. Daniel didn't yell, he didn't lash out, that would have been easier to handle. Instead, he stood there, his military composure unnervingly intact, scanning the scene like a general assessing the battlefield. "I see," he finally said, his voice low, calm, and cutting. His words sliced through the air, sharper than any weapon. "Both of you, get out." Jason hesitated, glancing at me for guidance. I could see the terror in his eyes, but I had no comfort to offer. My own heart was racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and dread. When Jason didn't move fast enough, Daniel took a single step forward. That was enough. Jason bolted out of the room without another word, leaving me alone with the man I had betrayed. I wanted to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. How do you justify the unjustifiable? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has sacrificed everything for you and admit that you've destroyed him? Daniel didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't even look at me. He turned and walked out, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway. Moments later, the front door slammed shut, and I was left alone in the wreckage of my choices. The hours that followed were a blur. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind, the way Daniel's jaw had clenched, the way his fists had tightened at his sides. But it was his silence that haunted me the most. Daniel wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He was methodical, calculating. I knew this about him, and it terrified me to think of what he might be planning. Jason called me later that evening, his voice shaky and full of regret. "We messed up, Claire," he said. "I don't think he'll ever forgive us." "What do you expect me to say, Jason?" I snapped, my guilt morphing into anger. "You shouldn't have been here in the first place." "You invited me over?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Don't act like this was all me." He was right, of course. I had invited him. I had opened the door to temptation, and now it had destroyed everything. But I couldn't face that truth. Not yet. Just stay away from him, I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And stay away from me." Jason sighed, and the line went dead. I was left in the quiet of my house, a house that now felt more like a prison. Every room reminded me of Daniel. The photos on the walls, the neatly folded blanket on the couch, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. It was unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel didn't come home. He didn't call, didn't text. It was as if he had vanished. I found out through a mutual friend that he had moved into a hotel near the base, but beyond that, he was a ghost. I tried reaching out, leaving voicemails and sending messages, but they all went unanswered. The silence was deafening. Then, one day, I received an envelope in the mail. It was from Daniel. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting divorce papers. Instead, I found a single sheet of paper with a brief, handwritten note. "You wanted attention, Claire, you've got it. Watch your back." Chills ran down my spine as I read the words. This wasn't the Daniel I knew. The patient, steady man who always took the high road. This was someone else entirely, someone shaped by betrayal and pain. And I had created him. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Our joint bank account was emptied, leaving me with nothing but the balance in my personal account. The locks on the house were changed, and I was served a notice stating that I had 30 days to vacate the property. Daniel had owned the house before we were married, and I had foolishly signed a prenuptial agreement waiving any claim to it. But the worst was yet to come. One morning, I woke up to find a stack of photographs on my doorstep. They were of me and Jason, laughing, touching, kissing. Some were taken on nights I thought we had been careful, others in broad daylight. My stomach turned as I realized that Daniel must have hired a private investigator. He had known about the affair long before he caught us in the act. There was no note with the photos, but the message was clear. Daniel wasn't just going to walk away. He was going to make sure I paid for what I had done. By the end of the month, I was living in a dingy apartment on the other side of town, far from the comfortable life I had once known. I was isolated, cut off from the social circle I had once been a part of. Word had spread about the affair, and no one wanted to associate with me anymore. Jason had disappeared, likely at Daniel's urging. I hadn't heard from him since the day I told him to stay away, and a part of me was relieved. He had been a mistake, a fleeting distraction that had cost me everything. As I sat in my tiny living room, surrounded by the consequences of my actions, I realized that Daniel's revenge wasn't about anger or spite. It was about control. He had taken everything from me, my home, my security, my dignity, and left me with nothing but regret. And the worst part? I knew I deserved it. Weeks passed, and the weight of my isolation grew heavier. Each day seemed to bring a new reminder of how far I had fallen. The carefully curated life I once prided myself on, our beautiful home, the friends who came over for barbecues, the sense of security that came with being Daniel's wife, had crumbled into ruins. I had traded all of it for a fleeting moment of passion, and the cost was immeasurable. Daniel's silence persisted, but his actions continued to speak volumes. Every few days, a new reminder of his control would appear. Sometimes it was a stack of legal papers, demanding full control of assets, pushing forward with the divorce, or a letter from his lawyer about another move to strip me of what little I had left. Other times it was something subtler, like a cryptic email with no subject line and just one word in the body: TikTok. He was playing a game of psychological warfare, and I was losing. One afternoon, as I sat in my apartment staring blankly at the bills piling up on the counter, a knock came at the door. My stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was Maria, my former best friend. I opened the door hesitantly. "Maria?" I asked, my voice betraying my surprise. Her expression was cold, almost unrecognizable. She stood with her arms crossed, her eyes scanning me as if she were trying to figure out what I had become. "I debated whether or not to come here," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "But I figured you should hear this from me." "Hear what?" I asked, my voice shaky. I wasn't sure I could take any more bad news. Maria turned to face me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Daniel hosted a dinner party last night. At the house." My breath caught. What? I hadn't even known he had moved back into the house. She nodded, her eyes narrowing. It was a celebration, apparently. He invited everyone, friends, colleagues, neighbors. He even brought his commanding officer and his wife. I sank onto the couch, my legs unable to support me. "Why would he do that?" Maria's gaze hardened. "To prove a point. To show that he's moved on, that he's better off without you, and to make sure everyone else knows it too." The room seemed to spin around me. Daniel's quiet, strategic dismantling of my life wasn't just about punishing me. It was about erasing me, replacing me. He was rewriting the narrative of our marriage, casting himself as the hero and me as the villain. Huh? Who did he invite as his date? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Maria hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. Her name's Elena. She's stunning, Claire, a military nurse, smart, kind, the kind of woman everyone adores. People were saying how lucky Daniel is to have found someone like her. I swallowed the lump in my throat. It wasn't jealousy, I felt. At least, not entirely. It was something deeper, a gnawing regret that I had thrown away a man who, despite his flaws, had been my rock, and now he was thriving without me. Maria sighed and sat down across from me. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what's happening. Daniel isn't just walking away, he's rebuilding, and he's doing it publicly. He's making sure everyone knows you don't exist in his life anymore. Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had cried enough over the past few months. Instead, I straightened my spine and looked at Maria. Why are you here then? If you're so disgusted by me, why bother? She exhaled sharply. Because I cared about you once, Claire. I still do, in a way. But you need to know that this is your reality now. Daniel's not coming back, and neither is anyone else. With that, she stood and walked to the door. She paused before leaving, glancing over her shoulder. Good luck, Claire. You're going to need it. After Maria left, I sat in silence, her words replaying in my mind. I knew she was right. I had hoped, deep down, that Daniel's revenge was temporary, that it was his way of processing his pain, and that eventually we might find a way back to each other. But it was clear now that there was no path back. He had moved on, and I was left in the ruins of my mistakes. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts and trying to lose myself in the monotony of my job. But even there, I couldn't escape Daniel's shadow. Colleagues whispered behind my back, their pity and judgment palpable. The rumors about my affair had spread far and wide, and I was now the subject of gossip and scorn. One evening, as I was leaving work, I found a small envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. My heart sank as I opened it, expecting another legal notice or a cruel reminder from Daniel. Instead, it was a photograph, a picture of me and Jason, taken during one of our stolen moments. Written on the back in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting were the words, "You reap what you sow." I clenched the photo in my hand, my anger bubbling to the surface. For months I had been drowning in guilt, ashamed of what I had done, but in that moment my anger eclipsed my shame. I was tired of being the victim of Daniel's calculated revenge. If he wanted to erase me, I would fight to keep my place in the story. That night, I made a decision. I would confront Daniel, not to beg for forgiveness, but to demand an end to this cruel game. I deserved his anger, but I didn't deserve to be destroyed. The next morning, I drove to our old house. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same, yet it felt foreign, like a place I no longer belonged. I hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car and walking to the front door. I rang the doorbell, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and there he was. Daniel. He looked different, stronger, happier. He was no longer the man I had betrayed. He was someone new. "What are you doing here, Claire?" he asked, his tone cold but composed. I took a deep breath, summoning the courage to speak. "We need to talk, Daniel. This has to stop." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped aside, letting me in. As I crossed the threshold, I realized I wasn't just walking into our old home. I was walking into the next chapter of this war. As I stepped into the house, memories hit me like a tidal wave. The familiar scent of pine and vanilla, The candles I used to light every evening still lingered, but everything else felt foreign. The furniture had been rearranged, the walls repainted in neutral tones, and the once cozy warmth of our home had been replaced with a sterile, impersonal atmosphere. Daniel closed the door behind me, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't offer me a seat or a drink. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned against the doorway, his sharp eyes locked on mine. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "Well," he finally said, his voice cold and detached, "what do you want, Claire?" I took a shaky breath, struggling to find the words. "I want to talk. About us. About everything." "There is no us," he replied, his tone like a blade. That ended the moment I walked into that bedroom. I flinched, the memory of that day still fresh in my mind. I know I hurt you, Daniel, more than I can ever put into words, but this punishment, it's too much. You've taken everything from me." His lips curled into a bitter smile. "Everything?" he echoed, pushing off the doorframe and stepping closer. "What I've taken is nothing compared to what you threw away, Claire. You destroyed the life we built together. You betrayed me, and now you want to play the victim?" "I'm not playing anything," I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But I can't live like this anymore, Daniel. You've made your point. You've won." "Won?" He laughed bitterly, the sound devoid of humor. "You think this is about winning? You think this is some kind of game to me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Do you know what it's like, Claire? To spend months away from home in some god-forsaken desert, risking my life every day, just to come back and find out that the one person I trusted more than anyone else had been sleeping with my own brother." "I know I can't undo what I did," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "But dragging this out, making me pay for it over and over, it's not helping either of us." Daniel's expression hardened. "This isn't about helping me, Claire. This is about consequences. Actions have consequences, and you don't get to walk away from this unscathed." I wiped at my tears, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "And what about you, Daniel? Do you think this revenge makes you better than me? Do you think it erases what happened?" For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or regret. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "It's not about being better," he said quietly. "It's about making sure you understand what you did, and making sure it never happens again." The tension in the room was suffocating, and I felt like I was on the verge of breaking. "So what now?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Are you going to keep this up forever? Is that your plan?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, Claire, I'm done. You're not worth any more of my time or energy." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my knees weaken. He walked past me, heading into the kitchen, and I followed, desperate to salvage some semblance of closure. "Daniel, please," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what you want from me." He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I don't want anything from you, Claire. Not anymore." The finality in his tone was like a dagger to the heart. I knew then that there was no going back, no chance of repairing the damage I had done. Daniel was moving on, and I was just a shadow of the life he had left behind. As I stood there, trying to hold myself together, the front door opened and a voice called out, "Daniel, I brought the paperwork you needed." I turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, her arms full of files and a warm smile on her face. She was beautiful, tall, poised, and effortlessly elegant. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, and she wore a tailored blazer that screamed professionalism. "Lena," Daniel said, his tone softening in a way that made my stomach twist. "You're early." She shrugged, setting the files down on the kitchen counter. "Figured I'd save you a trip to the office." Her eyes shifted to me, and I saw a flicker of recognition. Oh, she said, her smile faltering slightly. You must be Claire. I nodded, unable to speak. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, and I suddenly felt small and insignificant in her presence. Elena extended a hand, her smile polite but distant. It's nice to meet you. I shook her hand, my grip weak. You too, I mumbled, though the words felt hollow. Daniel watched the exchange silently, his expression guarded. Finally, Elena turned to him. I'll leave you two to talk. Let me know if you need anything else. Thanks, Elena, he said, his tone warm. She gave him a small smile before heading back out the door, leaving me alone with him once again. Who is she? I asked, though I already knew the answer. See, someone who treats me with respect, Daniel said simply. Something you couldn't do. I left the house that day feeling more broken than ever. Daniel's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the image of Elena, confident, capable, and everything I wasn't. He had moved on, and he had found someone who made him happy. For weeks after that, I struggled to find my footing. I buried myself in work, trying to distract myself from the emptiness that consumed me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the reality of what I had lost. And then one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Daniel. Inside was a single page, handwritten in his familiar script. I hope you've learned something from all of this, Claire. I loved you once, and I gave you everything I had, but love isn't enough without trust. I wish you the best, but this is goodbye. Tears blurred my vision as I read the letter, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the marriage I had lost, but for the person I used to be. I had betrayed Daniel, but in doing so, I had also betrayed myself. As I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, I realized that this was the closure I had been searching for. Daniel was gone, and it was time for me to let him go. The letter from Daniel stayed with me, tucked into the corner of my bedside table where I could see it every day. It was a bittersweet reminder of the life I had lost and the love I had destroyed. For weeks, I vacillated between anger at myself and anger at Daniel for his cold, calculated revenge. But as the days turned into months, the anger began to subside, replaced by a deep, aching regret. I threw myself into rebuilding what little I had left. My job became my sanctuary, the one place where I could keep my mind occupied and avoid the loneliness that haunted me. I stopped trying to reach out to old friends. Most of them had chosen sides, and none of them had chosen mine. It was better this way, I told myself. Clean slate, new start. But starting over wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. Everywhere I turned, I felt the weight of Daniel's absence. Grocery shopping alone felt like a punishment. Each quiet evening in my apartment, a reminder of how empty my life had become. I missed him more than I cared to admit, not just as a husband, but as a presence, a force that had once anchored me to the world. Now, I was adrift, searching for something I couldn't name. One cold evening, as I walked home from work, I passed by a small cafe on the corner of my street. Through the window, I saw a familiar figure sitting at a table, his head bent over a steaming cup of coffee. My heart skipped a beat. It was Jason. I froze, my mind racing. I hadn't seen him since the day I told him to stay away. Part of me wanted to keep walking, to avoid the mess of emotions that seeing him again would surely stir up. But another part, a darker, lonelier part, needed answers. Before I could second-guess myself, I stepped into the cafe, the bell above the door chiming softly. Jason looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as they met mine. "Claire," he said, his voice hesitant, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I admitted, sliding into the chair across from him. Up close, he looked different, thinner, more worn. The carefree charm that had once drawn me to him was gone, replaced by something heavier, more somber. "How have you been?" he asked, his tone careful. I let out a bitter laugh. "How do you think Daniel made sure I wouldn't forget what I did or who I did it with?" Jason winced, looking down at his coffee. "Yeah, I heard about that." "You heard," I snapped, the anger I'd been suppressing bubbling to the surface. "You got off easy, Jason. You disappeared. You didn't have to deal with the fallout." "I didn't disappear," he said, his voice low. "Daniel made it very clear that I wasn't welcome anywhere near him, or you. He cut me out of his life completely." "And you're surprised by that?" I shot back. "What did you think would happen, Jason? We betrayed him. Both of us." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think. That's the problem. I let myself get caught up in something I shouldn't have, and I've been paying for it ever since." "Not like I have," I muttered, bitterness lacing my words. Jason looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you still love him?" he asked softly. The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked down at the table, my silence answering for me. "I do," I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I always did. I didn't feel it anymore. Not the way I used to." Jason nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get it. I do. But you know he's never going to forgive us, right? He's moved on." "I know," I said, the weight of the truth settling over me like a heavy blanket. "I saw her, Elena." Jason flinched slightly at the name, but he didn't say anything. For a while we sat in silence, the noise of the cafe filling the space between us. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything, for what we did, for what it's done to you." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't enough, that his apology couldn't fix what had been broken. But as I looked at him, I realized that he was just as lost as I was. We were both paying the price for our mistakes, and there was no undoing what had been done. After that night, I didn't see Jason again. It was better that way. Our connection had been built on a foundation of deceit, and there was no rebuilding it. I needed to move forward, to find a way to live with myself and the choices I had made. Months turned into a year, and slowly I began to rebuild. I moved to a new apartment, started volunteering at a local shelter, and even enrolled in a few evening classes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. But the past has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. One afternoon, as I walked through the park near my apartment, I saw him. Daniel. He was sitting on a bench, laughing at something Elena had said. She was beside him, holding his hand, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked happy, effortlessly, undeniably happy. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to walk away before he saw me. But before I could move, his eyes met mine. For a moment we just stared at each other, the world around us fading into the background. Then, slowly, he nodded. A small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, but something close. Closure. I nodded back, a lump forming in my throat, and with that he turned back to Elena, his hand tightening around hers. I stood there for a moment longer, watching as they laughed together, before finally walking away. As I left the park, I felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and a quiet acceptance. Daniel had moved on, and so had I in my own way. Our story was over, but the lessons it had taught me would stay with me forever. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go, but in letting go, I found a strength I never knew I had. After seeing Daniel and Elena in the park, something inside me shifted. For months, I had been living with the weight of guilt and regret, but in that fleeting moment of eye contact, I felt a release, a strange, almost peaceful acceptance that I hadn't known I needed. Daniel had rebuilt his life, and though it stung to see him so happy without me, it also gave me permission to move forward. But moving forward was easier said than done. In the weeks following that encounter, I threw myself even harder into the routines I had built. I volunteered more often at the shelter, taking on extra responsibilities and pouring my energy into helping others. It was there, in the quiet moments of serving meals or organizing donations, that our coffee date turned into many, and before long, Mark became a steady presence in my life. He was patient and understanding, never pushing me to move faster than I was ready. With him, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. He didn't try to fix me or judge me for my past. He simply accepted me as I was, flaws and all. But even as our relationship deepened, I couldn't shake the fear that my past would catch up with me. I had been honest with Mark about my divorce, but I hadn't told him the full story of why my marriage had ended. The thought of him knowing the truth terrified me. What if he saw me the way so many others did, as a cheater, unworthy of trust or love? One evening, as we walked through the park together, I decided it was time to tell him. My heart pounded as I searched for the right words, but before I could speak, Mark stopped and turned to me. But even as I began to heal, the ghost of my past lingered. I had learned to live with regret, but there were moments, usually late at night, when the memories would creep in, threatening to undo the progress I had made. I wondered if Daniel ever thought about me, if he ever looked back on what we had shared before it all unraveled. I wasn't prepared for the day our paths would cross again. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. Mark and I were at the shelter, organizing a charity event to raise funds for families in need. The community center was bustling with activity, volunteers moving in every direction as we set up tables, hung decorations, and prepared for the evening ahead. I was focused on arranging a display of baked goods when I heard someone call my name. Clay? I froze, the tray of cookies trembling in my hands. I knew that voice. Turning slowly, I saw him. Daniel. He was standing near the entrance, his broad shoulders framed by the sunlight streaming through the open door. He looked the same and yet different, his posture still carrying the quiet confidence I had always admired, but with an air of calm I hadn't seen before. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment we just stared at each other, the noise of the room fading into the background. My heart raced, a mix of emotions flooding through me, shock, guilt, and a strange, bittersweet nostalgia. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, stepping closer. His tone was neutral, neither cold nor warm, and it unsettled me. "I could say the same," I replied, setting the tray down to steady my hands. "What are you doing here?" He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the decorations and tables. "Elena asked me to drop off some supplies. She's helping coordinate the event." "Of course. Elena." I should have known. How is she?" I asked, forcing myself to sound casual. "She's good," Daniel said, his lips curving into a small smile. "We're good." I nodded, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. That's great. I'm glad." He tilted his head slightly, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "And you? How are you, Claire?" The question caught me off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked me that with genuine interest. "I'm okay," I said after a pause. "Better, actually." His gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a hint of the man I had once known. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. Before I could respond, Mark appeared at my side, a clipboard in hand and a warm smile on his face. "Claire, we need someone to handle the raffle tickets. Think you can take that on?" "Sure," I said, grateful for the distraction. But as Mark turned to leave, Daniel's eyes shifted to him, his expression hardening slightly. "And this is?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. "This is Mark," I said, glancing between them. "We volunteer here together." Mark extended a hand, his smile easy and genuine. "Nice to meet you." Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking his hand. "Likewise." The tension between them was palpable, and I felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up my neck. Mark, ever perceptive, picked up on it and gave me a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "I'll let you two catch up," he said before walking away. As he left, Daniel turned back to me, his jaw tightening. "He seems nice." "He is," I said simply, not wanting to give Daniel any more than that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Look, Claire, I didn't come here to make things awkward. I guess I wanted to say that I'm glad you're doing okay. You look like you've found some peace." I swallowed hard, his words hitting me in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm trying," I admitted. "It's been a long road, but I'm getting there." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good, you deserve that." So I asked before I could stop myself. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between us. Daniel met my gaze, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "We all make mistakes, Claire. It's what we do after them that matters." His words, so simple yet profound, left me momentarily speechless. For so long, I had carried the belief that I didn't deserve forgiveness, not from him, and certainly not from myself. But hearing him say those words, it felt like a piece of the burden I had been carrying was lifted. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling. He offered me a small, almost wistful smile. "Take care of yourself, Claire." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, a swirl of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I watched him go, a part of me aching to call him back, to say something more, but I knew this was how it had to be. Our chapter had ended, and trying to rewrite it would only bring more pain. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what Daniel had said. We all make mistakes. It's what we do after them that matters. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of closure. Daniel had moved on, and so had I. There was no going back, no erasing what had happened, but there was also no need to keep punishing myself for it. I looked over at the photograph on my bedside table, the one from our honeymoon. For months, it had been a symbol of my regret, a reminder of what I had lost. But now, as I picked it up and held it in my hands, I saw it differently. It wasn't just a relic of a broken marriage. It was a testament to the love we had once shared, a love that, while flawed, had been real. With a deep breath, I placed the photo back on the table and turned off the light. The past was behind me, and for the first time in years, the future felt like it held promise. As I moved forward with my life, Mark became an integral part of it. He didn't try to replace the love I had lost, but he added to it in a way that felt new and hopeful. Together, we built something honest, something free of the mistakes that had once defined me. And though I would always carry the lessons of my past, I finally understood that they didn't have to define my future.